All right. So it looks like it's 6 p.m. where I live, which means it should be the beginning of the show. People in the OpenTech will save us room on Matrix who are already here. Can you tell me if you can hear us correctly? I'm just going to do a little dance in the meantime to keep you waiting while I get the answers. I see somebody typing. Okay, everybody can hear us. Loud and clear, that's wonderful. So, hello and welcome to this episode of OpenTech Will Save Us, in which we try to understand the social impact of software and how open source can make it more positive. This is a live and interactive show, so please come join us in the chat and ask questions to our guests. If you are watching the show from YouTube, you will find a link to the chat in the description. If you are watching the show from elsewhere, you can find the link to the chat by going to matrix.org/OTWSU for OpenTech Will Save Us. Our focus today is going to be platforms. It might not sound like the most exciting thing to discuss on Earth, but this is one of the major topics shaping software development for the general public. Don't just take my word for it. Apple and Google introduced two platforms, iOS and Android. They reshaped entirely how we interact with mobile devices and what we expect from them. We can see platforms sometimes as limiting. Apple is the most extreme example of platform providers severely limiting what app developers and even users can do on the platform. But platforms can also be enablers. What we see as limitations can also be guidelines to reduce the complexity that could exist both in the user and developer areas. To what extent this is acceptable is a topic in itself. Linux and the web are two areas of extreme freedom. Both are very flexible and put very little safeguards. On Linux, it's very easy to execute many things, including dangerous commands that will sabotage your system. As for the web, it was started as a document sharing protocol, but ended up being so flexible it's de facto used for running apps everywhere. It was also one of the key technologies opening the era of software as a service. In today's episode, we're going to be discussing Linux first. Can we create apps for Linux? What does Linux even mean today? Is fragmentation an issue? Is Linux a platform at all? I'm sure you have many more interesting questions on that matter. And to answer that, I have with me Alech and Nate from the KDE and Hagener Verein. I'm not sure I'm pronouncing that correctly, which means non-profit in German. And Tobias Bernhard, a designer working on GNOME, who has some interesting opinions to help us leave the comfort zone and explore alternatives. KDE and GNOME are desktop environments for the Linux desktop. To be very short and very wrong, they are providing most of the building blocks needed for you to have a desktop on your Linux computer. There is a lot more than that, but we could spend hours describing what they are and what else exists. We're then going to move to the web and Matrix as a platform with Florian and Robin, who work on Matryoshkaing widgets in Elements and everything VoIP. What does it mean? What will it allow developers and users to do? Is it required, or even is it enough to call Matrix an app platform? We'll see in the second part of the show. Let's get started with Linux as a platform. Aleix and Nate, this was the cause of a misunderstanding in the very first email I sent you, so I think it's worth clarifying. Can you tell me what people mean when they say, I'm developing an app for Linux? What is Linux in this context?
Well, it always depends, right? In practice, I think that we will all agree that an app is this uh, extension that you can include in your system that can perform a sometimes specific task. Maybe that would be a general enough definition of an app. And as such, but Linux is a kernel. We might see it as a little bit more, and I would say that yeah, Linux app is an app that runs on that kernel and also supports like the infrastructure that we have been creating all over the years. I think that this year, GNOME is celebrating the 25th anniversary. KDE, we celebrated it last year. And by that, I mean like that we have 25 years on our shoulders. And that's not to say that we're even the first ones at that, right? This means that there's been a lot of creativity among app developers trying to put tools for our users in the shape of apps that would be, well, the apps that we have been created, both GNOME and KDE and much beyond, right? Including, I don't know, LibreOffice, but also Google Chrome and uh, well, so on and so forth. There's so many. In practice, like you can see uh, systems like, for example, the system Steam Deck that they're running Windows applications as Linux apps. And actually, like we could even be having the conversation about, is the Windows platform part of the Linux app ecosystem? I'm sure we could find somebody that would say yes to that. So in practice, I would say that a Linux application is any application that works on Linux, and we can, well, progress the conversation from there.
Yeah, I also generally agree with Aleix. I think when people say they're developing a Linux application, to a certain extent, they're referring to something that does not, referring to a platform that doesn't formally exist, but it does exist as a de facto thing. When somebody says I'm making a Linux app, what they're saying is I'm making an app that will run on any system that uses the Linux kernel, that uses glibc, that uses these libraries, that has users who are probably using KDE Plasma or GNOME or XFCE. And the expectation is that it will run on these platforms. I think a great example of what I would call a Linux app is something like Blender. Blender does not specifically target any particular platform like Plasma or GNOME does, but it will run on any of these things. And it won't feel native on any of those platforms because it uses its own widget toolkit, it uses its own user interface style, but nonetheless, it runs on all these things. And so to me, that's a Linux app. Um, in a former job, I worked for a company that actually sold Linux software, and we didn't sell GNOME software, and we didn't sell KDE software. We sold Linux software, and we made sure that our software ran on Red Hat. We made sure that it ran on Ubuntu and a few other Linux-based operating systems. But we were very careful to say this is a Linux app. We're targeting Linux as a platform to the extent that such a thing exists. But we were definitely not targeting specific desktop environments. And so I think when you look at desktop environment platforms versus the Linux platform, you can say that one is a subset of the other. But I think there's absolutely something called a Linux platform that can have apps run on it, even if those apps are not specifically targeting a particular desktop environment.
All right. So in the context of GNOME and KDE, most of the time people see the very surface level of things. For example, when you are doing an application for GNOME, you will use GTK to write it. When you do one for KDE, you're going to use Qt. Most of the times, applications are much more complex than just a toolkit to draw windows and buttons. So what are the major building blocks people can rely on to target Linux as a platform, if we consider it to be a platform? Nate and Aleix, maybe?
All right, I'll start if nobody minds. So I think when you make a Linux app that is not specifically targeting either GNOME or GTK, what you do is you target the user experience that is a general computer user experience. Look at an app like Inkscape, for example. Inkscape uses GTK,
Mhm.
but Inkscape targets just a sort of general creative app user interface. It has menus, it has toolbars, it has buttons, it has modes, it has sidebars. And so while technically none of these things may specifically fall under the purview of a platform-specific set of human interface guidelines, these are all user interface elements that are common to most platforms. We're all pretty much familiar with these things, right? We've used menus, we use buttons, we've used contextual sidebars. And so really, nobody who has any experience with creative apps is going to have a problem using this software, even though it does not make an effort to specifically integrate with either Plasma or GNOME or Windows or Mac OS. So I think you're absolutely right to notice that there are elements beyond simply the user interface. Those things go to the libraries used, that we talk about the user interface, that the user experience that the app offers. but we've had a lot of time as a species to write software, and people are generally pretty familiar with the general use patterns of software. And so I think when you're writing, especially a cross-platform app, you need to make an effort to, as much as possible, use user interface elements and create a user experience that is itself largely cross-platform. That's something that will be familiar to everybody.
So I have something very specific in mind. Some application can require services from the platform they are going to be executed on. I'm thinking, for example, about keyring, secret sharing services, etc. They can access. Are there standard ways to provide those components? And if yes, is there a specification for that?
So in this case, I believe there is. There's a free desktop secret service spec that uses this, and all across the Linux world, apps can integrate support for it. We actually just gained support for it in the KDE world ourselves very recently. And so I think when you look at cross-platform apps, these free desktop specs are hugely helpful for giving developers a set of basic things they can target so that they don't have to feel like they reinvent the wheel all the time.
All right. Uh, if anything, the Linux world is famous for its bazillion distributions. To put it simply, for people who are not very familiar with the Linux world, a distribution is a set of pieces of software bundled together, in theory, to make a consistent product. That means if someone develops software for Linux, they actually need to handle the packaging of the software for the various distributions. Or is it still the case nowadays? Alish, maybe?
Well, we've collectively been working very hard at making this story a little bit simpler. I like with solutions like Flatpak, with like Snap, like App Image, where well, you can package your application and it's supposedly gonna work somewhat uh, on any Linux system with all of the asterisks you might wanna add. This is a horizontal approach that Linux has taken because there's a lot to win there. Like being forced to do every single distribution is not something feasible for any developer in existence. Um, that's not to say that it's a problem solved and that we're already there. There's a lot of distribution packagers who do their packaging like they've always done, and actually many of us to rely on that because, like I said, it's an ongoing effort. On the other hand, today we can say that you can write an application on one of these systems and it's gonna reach virtually every Linux user in the planet. And I think that this is a great thing.
Do you or Nate maybe want to expand a little on what are Flatpak, FlatHub, what are snaps, app images?
Sure, I'm happy to. Um, I don't know. I cannot see Nate anymore. He's frozen for me, so I don't know if he had a very excited face. He has a very excited face frozen on. So
Can you still hear me?
I
Yes,
can
we
hear
can.
you.
Oh, that's strange. Well, I can guarantee you that I am very excited.
Fair enough. Well, what I was meant to say is yes. Let's go through the different technologies very briefly, and then we see. First, you mentioned Flatpak, which is it started as a Red Hat slash GNOME project, I think, by Alexander Larsson. It's a format that you can target as a platform that should work more or less on any Linux distribution. Um, it supports also repositories, which is important because it allows you to well, have a set of them and make them available to users. One of these repositories would be FlatHub, which is a community um, endeavor that also GNOME started, and as KDE we take part on, as many other communities do, where well, all of the applications Flatpak packets are put there by a automatic system So you can find more or less every Linux application that works in there. One important aspect of Flatpak is that it has a security model that you need to respect somehow. So you will only be able to do the things that you have either requested access to, or that you're using the mechanisms to make sure that they are doable by a technology that we called XDG desktop portals, which is a technology. We can leave it at that. Snap would be a little bit of both. It's also a format, but also a store. The format and the tool is called Snapcraft. It was developed by Canonical, and it tries to do a little bit the same. It has some more use cases in the shape of IoT, for example, and non-strictly uh, graphical application kind of use cases. Trying not to use, by the way, the desktop kind of word, because it's a bit poised that way, especially when we have mobile phones running our software and all of these apps nowadays. So I think it's important to like, I don't know, find a good synonym. Actually, if we had that synonym, life would be so much simpler in many ways. Um, and then the third one would
You
be
could
app
use the
image.
word platform.
Yeah, maybe. App image would be a big file that includes all of the binaries that an application needs to execute itself, and as such is portable, assuming that it respects the like it has the same API as your Linux kernel. All of them are targeting Linux, which I think it's special that way. Not that not that this means that it's only gonna work on Linux. Like for example, if and I am not sure if the WSL thing that Microsoft did works properly, all of these applications should work over there. And a similar thing for BSD. I think that they do have some kind of compatibility layer for Linux applications, and but since they are Linux applications, they can be run that way. But it's well targeting that kernel, and it has all of the nuances taken into account for that operating system.
All right, we have an interesting comment already in the chat. We have Kitsune telling us, comment to the previous answer, freedesktop.org spec for secrets basically implies dbus services. They are a highlight of cross-distro services, but not necessarily very user visible. You told us about XDG portals, so I think one of the aspects of Flatpaks we have not necessarily mentioned is the sandboxing that they allow. Does anybody want to talk a little more about sandboxing and what portal allow us to do, what dbus is, and how all of that works together? Nate, maybe.
I'm going to hand this off to somebody else because I am not even going to be able to pretend to be a technical expert on those subjects.
I am happy.
Yeah,
If
go
you don't
ahead.
mind. So both Snap and Flatpak do have some level of sandboxing. Sandboxing being mechanisms to make sure that the application doesn't have access to all of the information on your operating system. Uh, the technical difference between how the both of them implemented, which is interesting in the context of this conversation, is that Flatpak does it on the user space side. So it's like a piece of software that we have that configures the process in the correct way so that when the application is launched, it's going to have the correct permissions. Whereas on Snap, it's using Linux kernel functionalities called there's SE Linux and there's the other one.
App Armor?
AppArmor, yes. So it's using this to when Snap starts an application, it uses AppArmor to make sure that to have the kernel make sure that your application is not gonna reach to these resources. Now both Flatpak and Snap will have some level of permissions that can be requested, like I don't know, access to the network. This is something that your application needs to request. But then there's some things that are requested at runtime generally, and we use XDG desktop portals for that. So or at least that's a way to differentiate them. Not that it needs to be on runtime, right? But in any case, for things like the open file dialog, we're using the desktop portals so that when you open a file on GNOME, you can use the portal to open a file and you will get the correct system dialog. And a similar thing when you run it using Plasma, etc. So we're using the XDG desktop portals to bridge these kind of features that we're gonna need when we use any application, because I mean the idea of your applications are not gonna need any sensitive information. I mean it's nice, but it's unrealistic, right? It's like your web browser is gonna need to see your screen if you want to screen share it with your friends and colleagues. Your Discord is gonna need to have access to your microphone if you want to talk when you're playing a game with your other friends. So while it would be nice to say, well, no application gets a microphone, then it would be shit experience for our users. So we are bridging that using the portals.
All right. So if I can summarize that, by default, Flatpak apps don't have access to anything on the computer, and when they are being packaged as Flatpaks, they can try to poke holes in the sandbox with the permission, which are very similar to what we can see on mobile devices when they ask access to the microphone or the camera, or ask access to the files on the system that is running them. So that would be what sandboxing is, and poking those little holes in the sandbox are what you call XDG portals, right?
Yeah, in a simplified way, yeah. Let's say yes.
In a very simplified way, yeah. Tobias, you are the author of the blog post series "There Is No Linux Platform." This gives us a good orientation, a good idea of your orientation. If the free desktop is not enough, so the free desktop as in the free desktop specification, that is the various services that can be provided on Linux, and dbus, which is the standard way to access to those various services. If the free desktop is not enough to make a platform from Linux, what is missing? What makes a good platform according to you?
I mean, I think the people who explained all of this concept so far like did a good job kind of like outlining where we are right now. But I think we would all agree that like where we are right now is not where we would like to be. We would like free software to be in the hands of a lot more people, and that requires getting a lot more developers on board, and that requires really like stepping up our game. And I think that is maybe where the difference in perspective lies. Like what we have right now sort of works in a lot of areas, but it isn't anywhere near the level of what sort of real platforms provide, for example, on mobile or on desktop operating systems. And that includes everything from really like the operating system in a way where you know like what that operating system stack is going to give you, not just like more or less like maybe this version, maybe that version, maybe it does have this portal, maybe it doesn't have this portal, maybe this or doesn't use EBUS in the first place. There's like a lot of variability there at the technical level, but then also like in terms of what is the user experience that you want to ship, and like how does it fit in with the rest of the system. And I mean, yes, it's true. Yeah, like you can just make your app like a rectangle and like only care about that and draw within that like all your own custom stuff. But then in practice, there are so many like levels where you want to integrate with the system, whether that's with the shell or like with the sort of workflows that people expect, or just like, yeah, I mean, all the portals that we just mentioned, that is something that people actually do need to do work for. And I think it's, well, so, okay, so that's one layer. And then, so if you want to make it all the way to actually people installing stuff, you also need a story for people to actually install those apps in a place that like sort of brings it all together in a nice user experience. And that whole thing together is what I would call a platform. I think we have like a lot of these different pieces in various places organized in slightly different ways in a thing that people call Linux. But I don't think that comes anywhere close to competing with the kinds of things we're up against. And I would like to be able to do that. And so that I think is my perspective, and I think the perspective that a lot of people, not just in the GNOME project, I think Elementary sees it the same way, have, that like if we want to really like get to the next level, like this is the kind of stuff that we need to be doing. We really need a vertically integrated thing that app developers can actually test against, that they can be sure like that you have a certain like baseline of things on your system and it's going to work. You can test against, then it's not going to like be a different color. It's not going to like miss the secrets portal or whatever, so that you can't store your password. Because those are real like problems that we see like from app developers, right? Like I've worked on many apps myself, and like this secret portal thing, for example, is like a bug that we got like hundreds of times uh, in Fractal, actually, a Matrix time, because some like system that someone was running like didn't have it. And so I think like you can say like, yeah, we have like all the pieces are there, like things are pretty good, like, you know, but you know, where do we want to go with all this? I guess that is my perspective.
I have a question for Tobias while we're on this subject. It sounds like what you're saying is that our attempts at a platform are very fragmented compared to what we see in the proprietary world, where we have, for example, the Windows platform and the Mac platform and the Android platform and so on. Would you say that having your definition of a platform requires a specific operating system that ships specific software that developers can target?
What do you mean by operating system? Like sort of something that people install, or
So, for example,
something that comes on the hardware? Because
Ubuntu,
like you can
right?
think this one step further. We want people to be able to just get the hardware with the thing
So let's
installed,
look
right?
at Ubuntu,
But
for
I mean, yeah.
example. Ubuntu has different versions. It's an operating system. It ships specific versions of specific libraries. And you as a developer can say, I'm going to make an app and I'm going to ensure that it runs on these Ubuntu versions here. In your viewpoint, would that make Ubuntu a platform?
Well, no, because they don't own all the other stuff, right? Like if you want to be a platform in the proper sense of it, you need to also own like the actual tech stack, right? Like they don't have a toolkit. They don't. I mean, they have an app store sort of, but like, you know, it's not really like at the point where you like really have all those pieces and they all neatly fit together in the way that they do like on iOS. And
Would
that
they
isn't to
need
say
their own kernel as well?
no, at the integration level, right? Like if you can like use software that you don't 100% like develop or contribute to, that's fine. But at the integration level, like you need to actually sort of bring all those things together in a cohesive way, and that means at least like contributing to the most important ones at the user experience level. And I think like on the GNOME side, that is why like a lot of GNOME people just contribute to stuff all over the stack, because we care about like making that whole thing work together, right? And I'm sure it's similar on the KDE side. I don't know, but like um, I think like if you're just like sort of taking a bunch of stuff and then being like, oh yeah, I put my logo on this, like this is now a platform, but you don't actually have the follow through across the stack, I don't think that is the same thing.
So in your mind, a platform requires integration, work at multiple levels of the stack, and follow through to make sure that everything works properly?
I would say so, although I mean, right, there's always nuance. Like elementary, I think does a better job than a lot of other people, even though they don't have that many people, right?
Yeah, I was
Well, like
about to say, it almost
yeah,
sounds like you're
but I mean, that's
reinventing a distro.
in what way?
Well, that's what a distro does, right? They decide what software to ship. They do ideally some level of integration between those components to make sure that they all work properly. They piece together an ideal user experience, and they like it sounds like some distros maybe do this better than others, but that's the scope of what a distro provides, right?
Well, but I mean, for the most part, they do not have a third-party developer ecosystem, and they do not have their own like sort of in-house software and like development stack, right? Elementary does mostly use GDK, but they have a bunch of their own stuff on top of that, and they have their own HIG, they have their own like world that people can develop for in a way that I don't know, like Manjaro, I think. I don't know. I don't. Not really familiar with other distros, but like I think Manjaro doesn't have that. So
So
that
elementary
is why I
OS
would
would
put
be
Whereas,
a platform to you then.
uh, it is a lot more so than other distros. I mean, ideally, you would have something. Wait, am I muted? No, I'm not. Sorry. Ideally,
I can hear you.
you would have something that like that really integrates everything, in a cohesive way and like is actually involved at all those layers to the highest possible extent. That is never going to be 100% because then you would have to do all the work, right? And that I
I
don't
was
think
about to ask,
that is
can you think of any
yeah,
examples of this?
in a free software world, no, because that is the whole idea, right? Like you share work where possible. However, the question is, at the end of the
where's
day,
that
do you have
line?
all the pieces, right?
So if we can't have a platform with one vendor controlling literally 100% of the stack, at what point does it, what's the percentage at which you do need to control the stack? Like if we can say, well, it's okay if you get your kernel from somewhere else, and well, it's okay if you get your basic system libraries from somewhere else. What is the actual cutoff point at which something is or isn't a platform anymore? Like what are the parts we can omit but still be a platform?
I mean, I think it's mostly like about the way the whole thing comes together in the end, and I think it's also a lot about like how on a community level how integrated you are with the various upstreams, because yeah, like maybe at the surface level you can't tell like whether this like put together like set of components is better integrated than this other one, but like at the lower levels, like it's possible that like these people are actually like building half of the lower level components, and therefore at the end of the day, like the whole thing is going to work better. And so I don't think it's a matter of percentages. I think it's a matter of like community integration and like sort of the ethos that you have in those communities. And I think in practice, it is fairly easy to tell like sort of where those points of concentration are, like because that is where the actual sort of like everyone who has a HIG, everyone who has like sort of a certain level of the higher level stack and the integration with those lower level pieces. I think you can call a platform in that way, in a way that you can't the people who just literally take like GNOME or KDE and like change a wallpaper.
I'm hearing a lot about
And I mean, obviously, yeah,
and
the store side
a
of it.
UI
Sorry.
toolkit here. So
Sorry.
are you saying that to be a platform requires more integration on the top side, where we're talking about the user experience and the HIG and the user interface toolkit, than it does on the lower level side when we're talking about kernel and system libraries and things?
Just before we carried away too far in the conversation, so I really like that because you are doing my job. I don't even have to ask questions. That's fantastic. Just before we get too carried away, can you explain what HIGs are? HIG for people who are not familiar.
Sure. HIG stands for Human Interface Guidelines, and traditionally that's a term used in like software design to describe kind of like the philosophy, the set of widgets, the like way you put them together, and yeah, just the general vibe of like the experience that you want to transmit. And like that is usually like the guidelines part refers to this being an actual document or website that like documents all of these patterns. So there's like a page on how to do buttons, there's a page on how to write user interface copy, there's a page on like, I don't know, yeah, what kinds of experiences you should build in the first place. And that is usually what do we mean by HIG? I guess it's a bit of a 90s term, but we still use it in the desktop world.
Yeah.
I guess like nowadays you would call it a design system if you want to be fancy, like because there's like a large overlap. Although and like some people are like, oh, this isn't quite whatever, but it's like sort of the style and use of widgets and stuff like that makes an interface.
Yeah. And GNOME has one, and KDE has one, and Elementary OS has one. There are various different ones out there. So this is interesting to me. It sounds like what you're saying is that a platform almost starts at the top with an ideal user experience and then flows down from there. So in other words, we would start with the GNOME HIG or the KDE HIG, and then we would go down and we would say, how do we implement the ideal that is described in this HIG? Would that be accurate or accurate-ish?
Yeah, I mean that's definitely an important part of it, but I think it is more complex than that because at least in the GNOME community, I think a lot of the reason why we're able to like often like sort of push large projects forward over a number of years is that integration with the lower layers of the stack, right? And often like sort of design problems are not just like, oh yeah, what color do we make the buttons? It's also like, are we able to deliver applications like in a sandbox way, like sort of that actually app developers can package themselves? Like it's it is more complex than that, and at least on the GNOME side, yeah, we think like sort of our values and like the kinds of things that we would like sort of our software to transmit are almost as important as just like which buttons you put where. But yes, obviously, like I think if you don't have that higher layer, like I think yeah, you do not have a platform. But so just one additional point, I think the other thing that is really important is the third party developer ecosystem. I think that is where I mean, obviously you need the HIG to have the third party developer ecosystem, but like that I think is a really crucial point that I think on the like free desktop in the free desktop world we have kind of like neglected over the last few decades in many ways, because that experience has been really terrible for a really long time, and we're slowly like starting to make it a little bit better. But like that I think is where things really sink or swim. Like, are you able to like consistently grow that third party developer ecosystem and like have a way for those apps to actually get to people? And I think a combination of those various factors together like gets you to a point where you have like something that is on the level of whatever iOS and so on. It is more complicated, and there's a lot of things that you can't really compare, but that would be my definition. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think so. Thank you for taking the time to explain that. I appreciate it.
Tobias, one thing I'm wondering after all those explanations, it looks like what you are describing is that we are lacking in the open source ecosystem of product vision. And by product vision, I mean something going further beyond software, beyond just software. You were talking about getting people who can buy the hardware with software already pre-installed, not having to install your own operating system, because this is not something most people want to do when they get a computer, except us computer enthusiasts. I know KDE has a partnership with Slimbook, for example, to provide such computers, and with other vendors. Actually, I don't remember. And for that, I think KDE has a distribution that is shipping the vanilla version of KDE. What is it, and why do you have such a system?
Well, for us, it's very important to be able to say, so if somebody comes to me and asks, how do I use your software? I need to give them an answer, right? The old answer of you download this operating system ISO thing from the internet, you turn it into a USB, and you nuke your operating system and you install this thing is bound to like break a lot of hearts, right? Like, is it gonna support your hardware? Is it gonna work well? Well, I mean, we do our best so that it does, and I mean, it does for the most of us. But then we're all also very careful when we buy our hardware, right? On the other hand, being able to tell this person, you just buy a device from there, and then you will see what we're working on. You will be able to use it. If you have a problem, I'm gonna be able to fix it and then deliver it to you. Um, this was part of the discussion on putting this together, and that's why we did it.
Yeah, so this KDE Neon operating system we have, to a certain extent, implements what Tobias is talking about, in that it gives us an actual operating system we can hand to vendors, and we can say, hey, here's our KDE platform. It starts from here, and we've got our widget toolkit, and we've got our human interface guidelines, and you can target this. And of course, that's not the only way to get KDE Plasma. There are many distributors who also distribute our software, and that's super duper important. But we have Neon as an operating system that's almost sort of the reference version. It's like, this is our vision, and you can change it if you want, but here's where we're starting from as our idea of what the final product should look like.
If I remember correctly, KDE Neon, so the reference implementation, I would say, of KDE, the reference distribution for KDE, which implements your vision, is based on Ubuntu. Why was it necessary to get KDE Neon created if Kubuntu already exists?
So maybe I wasn't very emphatic there, but I said when something needs changing, we can change it, and then our users have the changes in their systems. Whereas in traditional Linux distros, well, the decision on getting the user's experience fixed is on someone else. I mean, it's part of the discussion we've been having before as well on the third-party ecosystem, right? Like being able to put applications together that by the developers is also this. Otherwise, like we always have this kind of discussion of you get a bug report, is it a problem on the distro or is it your fault? Then you find the time to do the fix, you put it forward, and then you make a release, but then the distro says, well, no, we're super stable here, we're not going to take your crazy fixes here. And then your user is frustrated because he has or they have a broken system. Your distributor is frustrated because they cannot ship the fix and their users are frustrated. You as a developer, you wasted your time fixing something for somebody who cannot enjoy it, right? So in practice, like you get a solution where everybody is sad. Whereas if you use a model where when you produce a fix, it reaches your users, you get into a situation where it's actually worth it to put together a fix, which is encouraging for every developer and also users to report, etc., etc. Like this is not the only model. For example, there's rolling release distros as well. And in practice, KDE Neon is rolling in many ways. This was just a way that we found that it was for us affordable to do in terms of resources. It's based on Ubuntu, but not only Ubuntu, but Ubuntu LTS, meaning that the base is not gonna change much. I doubt that many kernel developers are using KDE Neon for that reason, right? Or I don't know. I mean, what do I know about kernel development? But I guess that you see what I mean.
All right, it makes sense. It seems to highlight one specific topic for me, which is developer empowerment. Sorry, especially when it comes to distribution. Tobias, I think you have pretty strong views on that. Do you want to expand a little on what your mind model is, your ideal model is for a platform when it comes to distribution of software?
I mean, I think we've already basically said everything, right? Like, I mean, the problem is that if you have somewhere between the person like making the software and the person enjoying the software, there's all kinds of things that can go wrong, and there's all kinds of incentives at that layer that can make that more complicated, slower, or just worse. And I think what we've tried very hard, what we've tried sort of to work towards very hard for the last decade or so, is to get to a more direct path from the developer to the person using the thing. And obviously Flatpak does it, but also just in general, the idea of like the Flatpak runtimes that are run by the actual people writing GNOME and KDE, as opposed to like, you know, a Ubuntu runtime or a Fedora runtime or whatever, is a different model of thinking about that relationship. And I think that is the sort of fundamental shift in thinking that we need to do, because I mean, what we've seen over and over, and I think Aleš already sort of had some good examples of this, is that if you have this layer in between, there are all of these priorities that in between layer has. Like, I don't know, everything needs to have a logo on it, or like we have this release cycle that we can't get off of because we use it for the server, and so therefore we can only ship a new version of your thing like every 3 years. But like all the actual like APIs that sort of apps depend on, like for example, Flatpak portals, all kinds of like shell features, stuff like that. That also depends on like that middle layer moving, and so then people are like trying to use an app built for the newer version of the platform, the actual platform, like the thing coming from GNOME or KDE, but like they're they don't have the, even with Flatpak, right? Like you can have situations where like that doesn't work, and I don't particularly see an alternative to vertical integration one way or the other. Whether that is replacing the traditional like sort of distribution model with something more direct, or I don't know, like a conglomerate of everyone agreeing on API stability or something. Like we're gonna have like, I don't know, LTS like version of everything with like specifically timed whatever version release schedule, stuff like that. But like we need to do something there, because what we have right now is like two models sort of trying to do their thing, and the result is mostly pain. Does that summarize it? Maybe Alesh wants to add.
So I was wondering, so I think we came from the position where we stated that having a platform would be nice for developers to ship the software in the Linux ecosystem to customers. But the developers would only use the platform if you have, let's say, a good opportunity to ship your software. And in the Linux world, we have the nice diversity. And the question right now is how can we ensure to embrace the diversity, but at the same time having a nice platform to ship software? Maybe that could be, so I'm wondering if there's a good concept tackling that one.
So I think that where Tobias brought the conversation to, and I think that it's a very interesting place, is the HIG as a platform kind of discussion, which I think that it makes a lot of sense. And in big terms, it's something that we're also doing, right? Like we have a HIG for a reason. So like people adopt it and their applications integrate properly. But when we talk about Linux as a platform as well, what we're talking about is like how do you make yourself available to Linux users? And by Linux users, it's probably even like free software, desktop people. I use desktop. I didn't want to. Whatever. For example, if Autodesk came today and said, "I want this AutoCAD thing to work on Linux," is the first thing that we're gonna put on their face, HIG. They're gonna have already a toolkit. They're gonna have a lot of things that they want to reuse. And actually, we know that our users do want to use this very expensive piece of software already, because well, it's important for their lives. I think that it's important that we have a set of technologies that are available for the engineers out at Autodesk to be able to start integrating with what we do, and to be available on FlatHub or Snap or whatever, and have our users be happy, even if they look a little bit out of place, like I don't know, Chrome does, right? Tobias, I see you.
Right.
I'd add to that though, right? Because like even if you don't care at all about the visual side, which it's totally fine that some apps don't do that, right? Like it's totally fine that Blender does its own thing, and that's not a problem, like from the perspective of like how I see a platform. But like even on the technical side, you still have problems because like maybe they need to like I don't know share the screen in Autodesk, or they need some kind of system level API, and for that you still need that integration. Like it's not just
We have this already, though, don't we? With portals.
because these things are evolving, and like every version, there's like some new ones, or like the API changes. Or for example, like last year, we took away access to like an API in GNOME Shell because I think Zoom was it? Yeah, I think it was Zoom was like using it to screen share. They were like using some internal API. So like
that was an example of Zoom not using the cross-desktop one, though. They were using your platform-specific API instead of using the cross-desktop one.
What I'm saying though is that stuff changes, and if it doesn't change in a predictable like way with a predictable schedule, then also Autodesk, like even people who don't care at all about like actual visual integration, are going to have these problems. And there's all kinds of like levels, like both more technical and more user facing. Like for example, I don't know, maybe your app like doesn't integrate at all with the platform HIG, but you want to like have a search provider. Now you like need to know what version of GNOME is running depending on like, or I don't know if there's like a way to do that kind of search provider thing in KDE, but like there are all kinds of like integration things with the system that you maybe care about even if you don't like design your app specifically for that. And I think
so. I agree entirely with that. I think that's a really great point. To me, that is a great argument in favor of greater cross-desktop collaboration on the XDG side. What you just said about search providers, you're absolutely right. I know in the GNOME world, you use Tracker. In the KDE world, we use Baloo. These don't talk to each other. They're different. So this is a great example of where we could all probably come together, sit down, write a spec, change each of our implementations to be conformant with that spec, and then any third party that wanted to could write a search provider that is just the Linux search provider, and then it would work for both of us. And I think that's something that really does help third parties. Instead saying, well, if you want to port Autodesk to Linux, you're going to just have to use the GNOME thing or use the KDE thing. I think that's what third parties don't want. They do want a specific thing they can target, and they want it to work for everybody, not just some things.
Yeah, I mean, that's perfectly fine. But the thing is, still, like, you have versions, right? Like, things are not like we make this one version of this API and then we never change it. Or, I don't know, the API didn't exist until
we do this in
and then it
KDE.
will exist.
So in KDE, we have a product called KDE Frameworks, and we offer an API stability guarantee over the lifetime of every major version. So for example, we're on version 5 right now. The API of anything that you write with KDE Frameworks 5.1 is guaranteed to be the same as the API version of software that you write with KDE Frameworks version 5.926. We offer that stability. And I think third parties absolutely want that kind of stability. And that's the kind of thing that, like, that's possible, right? We can do this. We don't need to change our APIs every 6 months. This is not important. This is not a requirement.
But you're adding new stuff. Well, I mean, we are adding new stuff all the time, right?
Like, you can add new things without changing the API of existing things, though, right?
But if, like, let's say we release a new portal like tomorrow, right? How long is it going to take for that to get into the next Ubuntu, let alone the next LTS Ubuntu? In the meantime,
right,
app developer X is writing an app like a month from now. It's like, okay, cool, there's this new whatever screenshot portal. I'm going to use it. Guess what? On Ubuntu, it's not going to work until February of 2024 or something.
Right, but that's a distribution issue, though, right? Like, Flatpak solves this because we can update to the latest versions of the APIs in our Flatpak platforms, right?
Yeah, but not if the distro doesn't update their version of Flatpak. But I mean, Flatpak is just one example. I'm just saying, like, every piece of this needs to be coordinated at some level, because otherwise, you still, like, as an app developer, are basically just like guessing what, like, people might be using and what versions those people might be on, and that's a huge burden to put on people, as opposed to, like, you target the GNOME runtime, this particular version, you know exactly, like, what kind of system services are going to be available in what version, you know what APIs are available, and all of that in one go, as opposed to, like, sort of being like, okay, we think like 20% of our users use Ubuntu, and then therefore we're gonna, or like this version of Ubuntu, and then therefore we're gonna, like, if def, like, an older API, you know what I'm saying? Like, what we have right now is messy.
So we do this all the time in KDE software. It's not that bad, but it sounds like what you're really saying is that it would be better if distributors were closer to upstream, and that maybe in your mind, their upstream would be the distributor. But let's not, I think, paint with too broad a brush here, because some distributors are very close to upstream. We have distributions like Arch that are rolling. We have distributions like OpenSUSE Tumbleweed that are rolling. We have Fedora that is sort of mostly rolling. So, you know, some distributors, I think, have already gotten this message and are providing relatively recent, if not the latest versions of software to users, and are following upstream more closely. So let's make sure that we're not lumping those distributors in with the ones who are shipping versions of software that are 1, 2, or 3 years old.
I mean, there's different ways to be close to upstream, right? I mean, I work for a company, Purism, that is incredibly close to upstream in the sense that, like, they they pay people to do a lot of work upstream. That's really important for the platform, and that's producing a lot of great software for everyone. However, we also, like, are based on Debian. And that means that, like, the base for everything is at any given point between, like, 0 and 2 or something years old. And that, like, even if you want to, like, sort of be as close as possible upstream, creates, like, a huge delta that you need to bridge and backport stuff to. And that, like, even with the best of intentions, can be a huge problem. Now, I know that this is a lot more complicated, and honestly, this is not really my topic. Like, I am on the design team, in case people didn't know that. Like, API versioning is not particularly, like, my main topic. But from an ecosystem perspective, I think it's really important to, like, think about these like the separation of concerns and, like, responsibilities across the ecosystem.
Yeah.
And I think, like, just abdicating that responsibility and being like, well, some distros are going to do it right, and others, well, you know, they're going to maybe eventually see the light, hasn't particularly gotten us very far.
That makes sense. But on the other hand, wouldn't the decision to base Pure OS on Debian be a Purism decision? Like you could have based PureOS on Arch, for example, and then you would have the latest versions of everything, and you wouldn't need to worry about backporting things all the time. That's what SteamOS is, for example. When we look at the Steam Deck, which is a piece of hardware that's shipping with KDE Plasma, SteamOS is an in-house OS made by Valve, but they based it on Arch. And so as a result, they can be as close to upstream as they need. They never need to backport fixes, at least theoretically, right? This is the idea. But couldn't PureOS do a similar thing and rebase on something like Arch rather than Debian if shipping really old base software is a problem?
I mean, that's a question for the PRS team. I'm not super familiar with like the decision making around like what base you use. I think often like it's also a matter of like the developer base that is available in various places. Like if all your people are like very good at Debian packaging, you're not going to switch to like Arch tomorrow. And I think like in general, like a lot of the weight, like sort of just material weight in terms of like where people are doing a lot of packaging work, is around these really old things. It's around like Debian stuff and RHEL.
Yeah.
And like the faster moving things tend to be like, I don't know, experimental-ish, or at least they're seen that way, and they're not used by anywhere near, I would like sort of venture to say, like, are not used by anywhere near the number of people that like Debian stable or whatever, like Ubuntu LTS or RHEL based stuff is. And therein lies the problem, because like even in those places, even if like for the most part Flatpak is fine, it doesn't solve that entire like problem for developers or people using the software those developers make. Because the platform, like from a developer point of view, is going to be GNOME and KDE, not like RHEL.
I think that the important thing here, like when we want to wrap this up anyway, is going to be that collaboration is gonna always be important, and we always have had like every spec has a version, and we have to like mimic any effort we do in the cases that work properly, and instead of the ones that don't. We have an example of one that hasn't worked, which has been the freedesktop.org project. Like as an organization, if it has hindered collaboration more than it has helped, and I think it's shown. On the other hand, Wayland, which also stemmed from freedesktop.org, interestingly, by using different tools and a different model, they have achieved much better ways to collaborate between the different projects. And I think that by using better tools and, well, making sure that people know each other, and in practice, actually, like not turning a social problem, a technical problem, just to make things easier, I think that it's going to, well, help this this platform, whatever ends up being, something that is as inclusive as I think we want it to be. So, well, Autodesk can come to Linux and say, I'm going to offer my products on your systems.
Yeah, I think Autodesk is a great example, because when Autodesk hypothetically says, hey, we want to make a Linux app, they're not going to come to KDE and say, hey, we want to make Autodesk a KDE app. And they're not going to go to GNOME and say, hey, we want to make Autodesk a GNOME app, right? They're going to say, we want Autodesk's products to work equally well for all of these people. And maybe this means that they forego a certain amount of integration with either Plasma or GNOME, but that's acceptable to them because they are a cross-platform company, and what they care most about is that they have a consistent branding and user experience for their own products across every platform.
I'm going to jump on that opportunity to talk about a slightly different but related topic. Yeah, sure. Go ahead.
I mean, I think like that is perfectly fine, right? Like, it's not that all of us need to choose to be a KDE app or not. I think the goal that I think we should be moving towards is they like see Linux as not like one huge blob, but like a bunch of like smaller but very discrete and targetable blobs. So they're like, we're gonna make it work for KDE, and we're gonna make it work for GNOME, and those are like very easily targetable things. And then, do we have to think about multiple things? Yes, but it's still a lot less work than like checking which distro has which version of which portal. Anyway.
Well, maybe like part of the problem here would be that when we say there is no Linux platform, it seems like you would be conveying that there is not actually a Linux platform where Like right now, it seems like there actually is, but there are some nuances which I think that we all agree that they're there. Like QA, it can be important, it can be complex, but it needs to be done. But that's not different to any other operating system, like Android, for example, which one would assume it's among the newer platforms we have around. Like the differences between versions and stuff, and the APIs differences that we have over there is also huge, right? So I mean, we're there. I think it's gonna be fine, and the more we collaborate, the better a platform we're gonna make.
Yeah. To me, I think that's the bottom line, is that if Autodesk, to continue with this example, says, I want to make a Linux app, they don't want to have to say, I want to make it work for GNOME, and I want to make it work for KDE. The more we can do for them by having cross-desktop specs, then the less work they need to do to integrate with any platform, right? So like then they can just target the Linux platform and automatically get good behavior on specific sub-platforms. And then if they choose to, they can micro-optimize for either KDE's platform or GNOME's platform or Elementary OS's platform, but they don't have to, because what they get automatically by implementing the cross-desktop things should generally be pretty good. I think that's a good thing to target.
So one of the things, so my key takeaway so far is that we seem to have two levels of platform. We seem to have a very technical platform with all the building blocks that the free desktop provides. Like if you want to target the Linux desktop, you should actually target the free desktop, which is going to provide you the various services, like for example, a secret service to store your passwords. But if you are targeting the free desktop, you should not expect to be deeply integrated into the user system. Your application is going to look alien on the system of the user, or might look alien on the system of the user. And I really like what you said, Nate, when you say micro targeting. So upper level platforms, I would say, so narrower scope platforms that are interoperable. But I think here we also have a difference of vision between you and Tobias in particular. When it comes to theming. For example, I know that Tobias really cares about application who are targeting the GNOME platform should always look like GNOME apps, even if they are run on KDE. On that topic in particular, Tobias, you are one of the people behind the website stopthemingmy.app.
I just wait. Can I
Yes.
add something to that?
Yeah.
I would like apps to look the way that people curate them, to be precise.
Right. It's important to say that. So I'm going to give you an opportunity to tell us more about that, because you created the website and initiative Stop Theming My App, and a lot of noise happened around this website. What is your actual message? Do you want to prevent theming entirely?
So I mean, I think like it's important to know the context of history there. I don't know like how much time do we want to devote to the subject, because it's already past 7.
Do you have 10 minutes?
But like, sort of sure. So in general, like the history of this topic is very long, and I think like if you see the activism that like app developers are doing now or have been doing over the last few years on this topic in a vacuum, like it might seem like a weird parochial issue that like some people's pet peeve. But like there's a long and deep history of distributions not giving a shit about like the stability guarantees of the toolkit and the That's Environment platform. And like app developers have for a very long time done a lot of extra work to like first of all like make like not do anything interesting visual in their apps because theming might break it, but then also like specifically fix issues that like people report and that like only happen in setups that they didn't want to support in the first place. And so I think like that creates this tension where like some people see it is that like, well, but this sort of almost works, even though like it technically just cannot, just structurally it's impossible. And then on the other hand, people are like, dude, we're doing all this extra work for shit that we didn't want to support, and they're really mad about it, right? And so I think that has in the GNOME community at least, but I think also in others, like I think people in and around Elementary feel the same way, sort of gotten us to a point where people are like, no, we need to like have the ability for app developers to actually test their stuff and know that like there isn't going to be somewhere in between it isn't just going to change in random ways, and then like they're gonna get the bugs for that, right? Because I think that is another like part of like actually taking responsibility for the user experience and like creating a platform on the level of the ones that we would like to compete with, because no one else does this kind of stuff, right? Like if Samsung tomorrow was like, well, we think the Instagram app should be green, and then like Instagram complains and they're like, yeah, but the Samsung brand, this says you should be green. This would not be okay anywhere else. And I think like from an ecosystem perspective, it's really healthy that like people are sort of finally have the, well, I guess finally, it's been a few years, have the courage to actually speak up about that, because it is a big issue.
All right. Well, time is ticking. We need to wrap up the Linux section to move to the web and Matrix. So thank you, Alesh, Nate, and Tobias for your time and answers. My personal conclusion here would be that it's possible to write apps that can technically run and be executed on the Linux desktop, so not on just Linux, but on the Linux desktop, thanks to the common building blocks we have, which is called the free desktop. A platform is a set of guidelines not to restrict freedom, but to reduce the complexity and chaos computers offer. It can be seen as a contract between the app developers and the end users. Breaking this contract should be possible if you really want to as a user, but it means you can't expect things to work because you broke the contract, even if in some cases it can keep working almost by accident. Different people are going to have different ideas about what should be in this contract. For example, should the theme be consistent? Should the theme be enforced or not? The diversity of projects exploring those possibilities should be celebrated, as they allow people to pick up the system that works best for them. So thank you very much, Alesh, Nate, and Tobias for joining me for this first part of OpenTech Will Save Us. And I see you another time, maybe? See you around?
You're very welcome. Thank you for having us on. It was an interesting conversation.
Yep, thanks a lot. I learned a lot today.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks for
Thank you.
joining.
Bye.
And now we're
Bye-bye.
going to move to the next topic, which is decentralized matrix-based apps. So Matrix is an open protocol for secure and decentralized communications. The most popular usage and what most people know about Matrix is instant messaging. You can participate in conversations called rooms to send text messages, pictures, and voice messages. But Matrix also supports widgets. Florian and Robin, you work at Element, the company behind one of the most advanced Matrix clients. You work on everything VoIP, and you're going to add fancy new VoIP features to Element using widgets. Can you tell us what are widgets and how we can use them?
Yes, I think we can do this. Thanks, Tip, for having us here today. So regarding, let's say, the widget things, I can give, let's say, a good overview, but when it comes to the details, I think Robin is the expert here. Basically, a widget is nothing else than just a web view or an iframe which you can attach into your Element web client. Yeah, it's simply HTML and some JavaScript content, and there is an API where you can interact with the underlying Matrix client. But this API is kind of restricted, and it grew over the time to the needs which we wanted to have in the one or the other widget. Yeah, on top of that, and I think we covered this earlier in that conversation, there's also a permission model similar to the permission model you know from the mobile applications, such so basically a widget can request certain permissions to access the timeline events or whatever. Yeah, so that's it in a nutshell, I would say.
So it's
Yes, and these widgets allow adding functionality into matrix rooms such that people using these rooms see, for example, dashboards embedded right within the rooms that relate to the kinds of conversations happening, or they can add additional functionalities such as video calls that can come and go as someone starts the conference and then ends it. And so at a high level, there are basically ways to extend the ways in which people use matrix rooms with HTML applications.
And maybe one of the examples we had in the past for the FOSDEM conference, I think the time schedule was presented in a way that we just integrated the widget. No? So that might be a good example for, yeah, let's say a very specific use case you can tackle with widgets.
So in theory, a widget can be any sort of web app we could have in a browser.
Yep, basically.
Yes. So their widgets are free to use the web platform to basically its fullest extent. So you can do anything from just displaying a static page to pulling data live from, say, a Grafana backend to display that fancy graphs in real time, or even do things such as WebRTC to deliver VoIP experiences within widgets.
All right, so that makes widgets very flexible, and that allows us to add a lot of functionalities in Matrix Room. But are there current limitations in widgets, things they cannot do?
Yes, so as Florian mentioned, there is a permission model that exists whenever a widget wants to do anything with the host Matrix client beyond just existing within it. And so because of this permission model, widgets need to be able to define ahead of time what functionality they expect to use, what functionality they need in order to operate. And unless these widgets are running from a trusted source, that means they need to ask the user for explicit approval whenever they start running. Now, if you have widgets that are running from a trusted source, such as one that's running on the same origin as your Matrix client, or the URL for it is coming from your home server's configuration, and they're saying you can trust this application, then you can sort of automatically approve these permissions and just have the experience be seamless. But otherwise, you do need to have this sort of permission model in place for security purposes, because if all widgets could just do anything with your matrix access token, simply by virtue of them, sort of existing in this iframe within your window, then they could, of course, intercept messages and do nefarious things.
Yeah, and moreover, I think also the mentioned API, so how the widget can interact with the underlying Matrix client, is somehow limited. No? So that would also be one of the limitations as of now.
Mhm. And another one would be that, so by default, widgets are, of course, just a bare iframe that is rendered somehow by the host client. And usually all of the interactions and visuals related to that widget would then be constrained to within that box. So to integrate more deeply into clients, that does need clients to actually put in work or effort to specifically support this kind of widget, or add these bits of UI that the widget is able to control, such as, I don't know, notifications or other surrounding UI elements. That's so you don't get that for free.
Right. So before we move into the next question, can you tell us what element call is?
Yes, we can do. How many time do I have? So basically, and Robin mentioned it earlier, so there is something which is called WebRTC. WebRTC are the primitives given you from a web browser to create a video conferencing application. So it's the whole stack from media device handling, so audio device and video device, but also handling the network layer, setting up a network connection, jitter buffer, and also the signal processing portion. Echo cancellation is included, automatic gain control, such that everybody in the conference has more or less the same volume, and maybe also noise reduction and other speech enhancement things we can think of. And all those base building blocks you can just take and create a video application out of it. What's missing within the WebRTC ecosystem is a so-called signaling layer. And this is where the Matrix protocol is a good idea, because you have a lot of things for free. You have authentication for free and, of course, end-to-end encryption. So that is, let's say, quite obvious starting point to take the WebRTC system, which is more or less for free, and it's in every web browser because it belongs to the web browser stack of modern web browsers, and the Matrix protocol on the other side, and just put them together and build a thing which we call element call. We developed it from scratch. Yep.
Before moving on, you mentioned signaling. Can you tell us
Yep.
a bit more about what signaling is and how is it connected to element call and WebRTC?
Yeah, thanks. So when I want to start a call, I need some kind of signaling because I had to tell you I want to make a call with you. So that is, let's say, the intent. But also on top of that, we need to figure out the IP addresses and so on and so forth. So we need to exchange a lot of information before we can start the call. So the first thing we have to establish is the network connection. On top of that, we have to decide for the audio connection, at least, which audio codec do we want to use. And the same belongs to the video codec. We have to agree on the resolution. So how many bandwidth do we want to spend for this video call, and so on and so forth. And if we want to extend the conference from a one-on-one call to a group call, you could imagine we have a lot of other signaling taking place. Muting, all those stuff is part of signaling. And also in the recent past, we integrated the push-to-talk feature into element call, where you can have this funny, let's say, walkie-talkie style conversation. And also there, this is built on top of element call, and it's just another business logic, and that one relies on signaling as well. Does that answer somehow the question? You muted? Or I'm muted?
Oh, sorry, I'm muted. It does answer the questions.
Cool. Yeah.
So yes, so in a way, element call is taking everything that is allowing people to send audio and video signal in browsers and adding matrix as pipes between two users to say, I want to start a conversation. Let's do it this way. And doing all the magic that's needed to actually get the two users connected and using the right pipe and speaking the same language. So my next question would be, why don't you just shove element call, which is web app, inside a widget and call it a day? You have added native matrix calling to element.
Yeah. Maybe one step back. Why did we create element call in the green field? It's just a matrix client, but it's not using chat at the very first beginning. We really tried on the green field to establish element call. So what I just described some minutes back, and it was also a nice example that you can use the matrix protocol not just for chat but also for other things. And now we are at the point where they say, yeah, we want to have element call being part of our element web or whatever clients we want to ship. And as I mentioned earlier, so the web browser stack has a lot of interesting things included. So if we now have to integrate video encoding, this is network layer, jitter buffer, echo control, and so on and so forth into our native apps like the mobile apps, it would be a huge effort to do. So it's a really good idea to use this single page web application and try to integrate it just as it is into our native clients and also the web clients, because it saves a lot of engineering hours. And next question is, why just not putting it into a web API or a widget API? Theoretically, we can do it. You can just, since it's more or less just a web view, we can do it, but then it would behave as a second matrix client. And what we really would like to have, the element call should be as native as possible within our element chatting ecosystem, and therefore we need to have it integrated more closely. And now the idea is that therefore we would need the aforementioned widget API to speak a lot of other native matrix APIs. And I think that's the missing portion. That's the reason why we cannot just add element call as an web app.
And to approach that question from more of an perspective of interoperability, so the specification that's driving all of this WebRTC experience is called MSC 341, which specifies all of the signaling and everything that has to happen to create these conferences. And it works, as many things in Matrix do, by sending events into a room. So you have an event for saying, I'm starting a call, an event for saying, I'm joining that call and another event for leaving. And so for interoperability's sake, we want to be able to use the exact same room that the user is looking at in their Element client, and not a separate one that's sort of sealed off within the Element call widget. And so for that purpose, we do need to go beyond just having this be a widget that acts as a bare web view. And this is all because we don't, at the end of the day, we don't want Element Call to be the only implementation of this VoIP stack out there. For example, there's already the Hydrogen client, which is implementing some of MSC 30401 and Third Room as well. And so for all of these different applications, we don't want them to have to like look at a room and see, oh, there's an Element Call widget. We need to do this hack to look at the URL and see what room it is actually using and then go there. They need to just be able to go in the room and interact with VoIP directly.
All right, so this is what is driving Matryoshkaing. So first of all, who came up with that name? Because it's really hard to pronounce. And are there other usages than Element Call that are going to benefit from Matryoshkaing?
Yes, yes, and yes. So first of all, it was meant to be a very internal name, but all the people really liked the name somehow, and now it's slipped into the public. I'm not sure, was it Matthew? And I think,
It
yeah,
probably was.
yeah, I think he was it. And yeah, we all liked it, and nobody uses the MSC name for it, so we all call it Matryoshka. I think that's a short story regarding the name. And I think where it comes is clear, right? So it's the puppets which are puppeting and so on and so forth. Yes, of course. Whenever you, or nowadays we increasingly see that a lot of developers create completely new matrix clients as single page application, similar to Element Web. And going forward, we could also think of Third Room. Huh? So this is the VR, the VR, how do we phrase it? The metaverse implementation of within the Matrix ecosystem. We don't like the word metaverse, but I think now the idea is clear. It's also developed as single page application, and it would be super cool if we can integrate all of those single page applications easily into let's say a mainline application where you want to concentrate a lot of different experiences. And that's the reason why we tried to think in the direction that we can, yeah, build a matrix client on top of a matrix client. And the nice idea here is that the heavy lifting regarding authentication and end-to-end encryption is carried out by the underlying matrix client. And yeah, let's say that was the starting point. And our practical problem we wanted to solve is, yeah, just integrate Element Call into our mainline apps.
And so beyond Element Call, is it going to enable new users for widgets, for example? I'm thinking, for example, if I'm a developer and I want to have more access, more control on the end user, on the people's matrix account in the room, will it allow me to create more complex applications based on matrix using rooms?
Ah, I see. So, okay. I think this is at the current point in time, it's not scoped, but now going to the green field, I think that would be a perfect opportunity. So, using, so we would need kind of a layout system where you can have a room configuration, which gives you certain different configurations. If you think about video rooms we currently have, we kind of have it. So the video presentation is, let's say, the first class citizen. On the right-hand side, you have then the timeline with the chat. And similar things you can, of course, imagine if you have, let's say, a more generalized widget concept within our app. And then, yes, of course, I think then it's just defining a grid of widgets, and then you can embed different single page applications or whatever to it. And yeah, I think that would be a pretty cool opportunity. I personally would be really in favor having a whiteboard integrated into Element, especially in the, let's say, work from home situation.
Right, so it would be pretty cool to be able to have every Matrix client as a sort of browser, and not just a chat client, but a sort of browser that you can arrange widgets and maybe get the layout sorted out for you to get more complex applications. But it's not here yet. This is not something that we have, and this is not something that Matryoshka is going to bring directly. So it will require a bit more work.
Yep.
My next question would be, will Matryoshka be enough to make Matrix a platform to develop apps, or do you have other ideas you want to explore? I think you mentioned a sort of app store earlier.
Yeah, so that is also, yeah, as a first of all, to answer the first part of the question is, I think if we integrate the Matryoshka, so matrix client on top of a matrix client, that would solve that would solve the thing, because then you have a single client where you can have a lot of different experiences integrated. That would be cool. And then the next question, of course, is to be a platform, the accessibility must be easy. And then we're pretty fast discussing what about an app store. And the app store within the Matrix ecosystem is, yeah, a hard challenge, because the idea is to be decentralized. Yeah. So now the question is, if you have a look at the common implementation of an app store, it's centralized. So you have mobile app stores, or also for the big operating systems, they have app store included. Yeah, and maybe something like a curated awesome list, whatever, could help here, or something like a decentralized reputation, where you have some recommendations which a lot of people approved. Yeah, but I think that it's really a new territory, a new space, and yeah, we need to think through it. Yeah. But first of all, to get there, we need the base building blocks. So it would be super cool to have the Matryoshka ready. And the next thing then would be that it would be easy to define which of those widgets are part of a room, and maybe also have a layout system.
Yes. On the other hand, I'm thinking about the developer experience. The Matryoshka work that we're doing for Element Call isn't necessarily going to fully make widgets a platform that any app could come along and instantly build on, because the way we're currently approaching it with the widget API is we're punching basically individual holes in it for each part of Matrix that we want widgets to be able to access. So for example, for Element Call alone, we've had to write a spec change for sending and receiving 2 device messages, a spec change for getting turn servers, which would not be something the widget has access to otherwise. So I think it would still be a bit of a long road before we get to a place where there's enough functionality exposed over the widget API that any app could just come along and use the widget API as sort of a pseudo client server API. But we're, getting closer.
Yeah, so that's the decision, that we just integrate those portions we currently need. So that is basically the implementation approach. Yeah, and the reason behind it is also that we need to be really careful because of privacy and security reasons. So that's the reason why we need to be really careful while implementing the widget API.
All right, so not biting more than we can chew, which is very important to deliver quality experience to people. So if I was about to summarize what we said about Element Call, widgets, Matryoshka widget, is we have plenty of ideas, but we have priorities as well, and we have only so much time and staff to execute. So the potential is here, but we don't have all the building blocks, and we don't have the vision entirely set in stone either. So I would use that opportunity to invite people to contribute to Matrix. If you want to get started, if you are excited about the idea of getting an app store to get advanced widgets that could enhance the Matrix experience for everybody, in their clients, please join us. You can join the This Week in Matrix room, in which we share all the projects that are advancing. You can have a look at the specification. You can hang in the Matrix, the various Matrix repositories, so the matrix-org organization on GitHub, to have a good idea of what's happening in the Matrix.org Foundation, and help us actually to get closer to a platform that people can use to develop applications based on Matrix. But we are not quite here yet, so join us, please. Anything you want to add, Florian and Robin?
From my side, I think we really covered everything. If you would not have asked the people, I would now have done it. Yeah, thanks a lot. Thanks for having me here, and it was really a nice discussion today.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you very much, the both of you. So as you could see, platforms are a complex topic, and not everyone agrees on what makes a good platform, or even what a platform is, actually. They can appear as scary at first, but I personally consider them to be really necessary. They help managing user expectations, they help developers having a more clear target for their applications, and they can also allow developers to build more robust apps by limiting the entropy of the systems they need to test against. Eventually, platforms are all about trade-offs. What trade-off you are willing to accept is really up to you, whether you are a platform provider, an app developer, or an end user. Distributions and applications distribution and applications are empowering developers, and those are key topics that are not necessarily solved today in the open source world. All in all, the open source ecosystem is still vibrant and willing to explore the alternatives that are in front of us. I'm happy that there is a variety of projects and that they can coexist peacefully. Many of the projects in the open source world are maintained by volunteers, so I strongly encourage you to support these projects if you can afford it, be it with your donations, with your time and knowledge, or simply by being thankful of all the incredible work people are doing. That's it for this episode. I see you in a month, at the end of August. In the meantime, take care and be nice to each other. See you around.
Bye-bye.